myself. Oh, okay. It's great. Got it. Okay, so now the recording begins. So I'll just start by, well, probably don't need to rehash what I just said, but welcome to the presentation today. I'm going to talk about learning styles and what the story is with them. I think we all are familiar with the term learning styles. We've all encountered learning styles. We may have well been tested to determine what sort of learning style we are or we have as a person. And so hopefully through the course of today's presentation, you'll learn a little bit more. I've certainly learned quite a bit in preparing for this presentation. And I'll just say again, so it's recorded on record. I'm by no means an expert in this area, but it's certainly an area of interest of mine. And it's part of also one of the reasons I wanted to do it in front of, or for Grand Rounds, is because it's also a requirement for a program that my colleague Liz Teo and I are both taking it right now, the Education Scholars Program down at U of T, which, by the way, I would encourage anyone to enroll. It's a really terrific program. These are my disclosures. And then the learning objectives for today. So at the end of today's session, the attendees should be able to appreciate the intention of limitations and risks associated with the use of learning styles, discuss the evidence for and against the use of or need for learning styles, and then outline alternative evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning. So I originally wanted to have this as a polling question, but unfortunately, I don't have the access to in Zoom to create a set of polling questions. There are three, I believe, that I'm going to ask for a presentation today. And so for those of you that are brave enough to take yourself off video or just unmute yourself or even type in the chat, I guess I should have put these labeled them as A, B, C, and D. But I think we can figure that out as we go. So the first question is, how would you define a learning style? So a way in which an individual is best suited to learn and which is based on individual factors. The way in which each learner begins to concentrate on, process, absorb, and retain new and difficult information. The way in which one learns is fashionable and not sure would be your last choice. Okay, so far we've got A, B question mark. Okay. Anyone willing to unmute? No? Okay. So I would say there are two correct answers here. C and D, the way in which one learns is fashionable and not sure. No, truthfully, A and B, the first two would actually be considered definitions of learning styles. But it's important to note that learning styles, there are many different types of learning styles, and you'll find out a little bit more in a few slides. But and each one may have a slightly variant definition. So the way in which each learner begins to concentrate on, process, absorb, and retain new and difficult information is a definition that was created by Honey and Mumford, which I always draws my mind to Honey Mustard, but those two researchers came up with their own sort of learning style, learning inventory, and so this is their definition. I sort of created the first one is a way in which an individual is best suited to learn and which is based on individual factors, which really encompasses many of the different learning style inventories. So what are learning styles? Okay, here's yet another definition. A characteristic cognitive, affective, and psychosocial behaviors that serve as relatively stable indicators of how learners perceive, interact, and respond to the learning environment. So this is, again, yet another definition of what this particular learning style is. Another one is the educational equivalent of homeopathy, medical concept for which no evidence exists yet in which belief and use persists. And what you'll find if you do reading in this area research is you'll find a certain number of authors with very strong opinions, ideas of what learning styles are good for and what they're not good for. As you can tell, Newton is a proponent for not using learning styles. But the premise of learning styles is kind of interesting, and it's very attractive to a lot of people. So people are thought to receive and process information differently. And by identifying each person's style of learning, it will allow others to tailor the teaching to that individual, and therefore they will learn better and they will achieve more. And those who do not receive instruction in a manner that matches their learning style are at a disadvantage. So this is the thought behind the idea or the learning style hypothesis, as it were. So what about learning starts? So they were originally introduced in the 50s. Some sources will say even earlier. They really, really blossomed in the 70s and also the 80s, and continued through the 90s and the 2000s, and even to this day are still a common approach used in teaching and learning. And it's interesting, in preparing for this talk, I came across a number of recently published articles. I would have to say predominantly from other parts of the world that were still really supportive of use of learning styles. So they're also classified as different types of learning styles. There's theoretical, there's, and I'll talk about the others as well on a few other slides. So theoretical is really, they're created developed for testing learning style constructs. And that includes instructional preferences, so desired learning environments, attitudes to different types of lectures and coursework. Also, they include information processing, so sensory to long-term memory pathways. We'll talk a little bit about that with one of the frameworks, and then cognitive personality style, so learning-related behavioral characteristics. So, to what degree do individuals have an impulsivity versus reflectivity when problem solving, as an example. Pedagogical. And I always struggle with this word. Is it pedagogical? You would say pedagogue. So in that regard, one would think pedagogical, but it's a bit odd sounding in any event. So these are developed for the use in teaching and learning, and they're used to enhance learning from a practical standpoint, have been studied by academics in several fields. And then there are the commercial learning style tools. And so they have been developed and marketed for educators and managers to be used. And there's some controversy, and this is one of the concerns that some researchers have about learning styles, is they're marketed as a tool, but there's little to no evidence behind them. And so, how effective are they? Is this more of a money-making scheme? Is it a cost to the system, and so forth? So a very, let's say, landmark publication was released in 2004 by Caulfield and colleagues, and they identified 71 individual learning style frameworks. Okay, so that's a pretty big, and there might be more, but at that time, 71, of which there were 13 unique models and 58 adaptations of the models. So not insignificant in number. We also, a lot of people will talk about learning preferences versus learning style hypothesis. And so there is a difference between them. So learning preferences are an individual's preferences for one's mode of learning new information and for studying. So there's no argument that a lot of us will say, well, I prefer to do it this way, or in this case, I prefer using this or that kind of method or that approach to learning and studying. Learning styles hypothesis, though, purports that learning is not or is less effective if teaching does not account for an individual's learning style. So you're not providing a learner material or delivering that material in a way in which matches, and we'll talk about matching hypothesis a little bit, which is basically this, is that if it doesn't match their learning style, then they will be at a disadvantage. They will not achieve what they're supposed to. And then just further to that, a bit more detail about learning style frameworks. I'm just going to sort of talk about two that are very common, are those that allow one to obtain information through the senses. So the visual, auditory, read, write, kinesthetic, or VARC, as they call it. And this relies on multiple learning and perception of experiences. So Kolb is a very, very popular, common one, learning styles inventory. Honey and Mumford Learning Styles Questionnaire. And there's actually one for pharmacists, which I wasn't aware of, but it's called PILS, Pharmacist Inventory of Learning Styles. I know, not very imaginative, I guess, but what are you going to do? This is just another part of a table that I thought was quite helpful, just to sort of give you a bit of a different idea about some of the more common learning styles and then the preference characteristics. So if you're a visual learner, for instance, you would learn better if you were presented with graphics, maps, diagrams, charts. If you're a read-write, manuals, essays, and reports, kinesthetics, simulations, demonstrations, practical applications. And then there's the Kolb Learning Style Inventory, which again talks about, and I'll go in a bit more detail, divergers, accommodators, simulators, convergers, and this is based more on experience and reflection and application of situations and experiences. And then Honey and Mumford is slightly different there. There's the PILS, Pharmacist Inventory of Learning Styles, and a few others, which I won't talk about at this time. So what about the Kolb Learning Style Inventory? So Kolb presented this, I think, back, it's a bit of a multi-level concept and framework. And so there are really sort of two parts to it. So initially, there is the learning cycle. And so that starts with, it actually can start at any point in the cycle, but we'll start, for argument's sake today, at the concrete experience, which incorporates feeling. So that then, when you have an experience, how does it make you feel? What do you take from that? And then you observe. Reflective observation is watching, and what are you seeing? What are you reflecting on as far as what you're taking in? And then there's abstract conceptualization. So thinking, okay, so you experience something, you're reflecting on it, and now you're thinking about, okay, what can I take from this? Are there any sort of generalizations that can make? And then there's active experimentation. So let's apply what I've learned and continue to sort of see what happens, sort of a trial and error, and then keep going up, and then back to the concrete experience. So you by creating or by identifying generalizations, now you're now applying it, keeping in mind those generalizations, and then you return back to the experience. And so how did that turn out? And then you re-reflect on it. Sort of reminds me of a PDSA kind of cycle. The other part to this that Kolb introduced was this idea of a processing continuum and a perception continuum. And so then these play a role in the entire process by dividing or if you will, into different categories. So divergers, who are more inclined to watch and perhaps participate or experience something. And then we have the assimilating, which is more of a think and watch. So let's reflect on it. Let's see what I can draw from this sort of material. Converging, okay, well, these are some of the principles that I have or that I know about this, and let's see if I can apply that to a situation. And then there's accommodating. So how, I've applied it, does it kind of feel, what am I taking away from this? And the idea is that each one of us is more inclined to one area versus another, or one category versus another. Another common approach, which will often see, and I've had many people over the years tell me, oh, I'm a this kind of learner or that kind of learner. And even I've been under the impression that I'm a visual learner. Oh, I love pictures. I'm a very visual person, but I've reflected on it since, and I can read about how to, change a tire, but there's also a difference in if I actually do change the tire. I'm sure I will be a lot more proficient if I physically do it. So here's a polling question. Do you feel or believe you have a learning style? Yes, no, or unsure? And again, you can type in the chat, you can unmute, whatever you like. Everyone is saying yes. Wow. Okay. So again, for those of you who may have come in late, the learning preference is one thing. A learning style is something else. And a learning style is how you've been identified by using a tool, for instance. That, okay, well, you've been identified, and this is one of the limitations we'll talk a little bit about later. One of the limitations about using these learning style inventories and these assessments is that there's not felt to be a lot of reliability or validity in doing them. They're based on preferences, and you can rank, and at least in some of them, you rank your preferences. And so it's kind of, you're sort of guiding what that learning style is based on what you prefer in some cases. And that may not be, what you may prefer or how you think you prefer to learn may not actually be how you best learn. And that's another discussion I won't include in this talk, but that is something that has come up as well in the literature. So there are a few other answers. No, it depends on the topic, and yes, possibly more than one, as well as a resounding number of yeses. Okay, so if you do feel that you are have a learning style, what learning style do you feel you are? And so this is, I'm just going to keep it with the visual, auditory, read, write, and kinesthetic. So please, as we have an example that I hope is going to illustrate things in a bit of fun as well. Okay, visuals, got a lot of visuals. Yeah, a lot of visuals. Visual and auditory, kinesthetic. Okay, well, I would not want to be a kinesthetic when we talk about our example, but read, write, visual. Okay, visual, auditory. This is great. I really appreciate all of the input that you guys are giving. Okay, so if we go to an example, my example is this. Oh, why is this not working? Are grizzly bears dangerous? Okay, so if you're a visual learner, then, and I wish I could have put this on video, but in any event, this is the kind of style that you should be learning. So if you were to go to a class, your teacher should put you in a plexiglass cube with a grizzly bear. And then you can actually see visually how dangerous these animals are. If you're an auditory learner, and I don't know if you'll be able to hear this, but this is from a movie, it's not real, so just to give you a warning. Okay, so that probably illustrates the point. It's not real again. It's from a movie, The Revenant, which I would I would recommend to everybody. It's a great film, but that bear scene is like unbelievable. So anyway, so if you're an auditory learner, I would hope that that teaches you that, you know, or gives you the idea that, yeah, bears don't sound very friendly. There are read-write learners. So like Timothy Treadwell here, he's reading about Alaskan brown bears. And then if you're a kinesthetic learner, this would sort of be what you might expect, where you'd have to learn, you know, oh, let's go play with bears, just to see if they are actually dangerous. I know I'm breaking it down very basically, but the idea is that that is the idea behind some of these learning styles, in particular the bark. Now, multimodal approach is actually a good thing, and that's what's recommended. And I'll touch on that a bit later. Unfortunately, just so you know, that Timothy Treadwell was a visual learner, a read-write learner. He was unfortunately a kinesthetic learner as well. And he and his girlfriend, Amy, were unfortunately mauled to death and mostly eaten by grizzly bears, or a grizzly bear. So again, interesting way to approach learning. This is probably not the best way, but it was just, I tried to have a fun example of this. Okay, so what about the evidence? When we talk about, and it's interesting because I was recently reading an article where they had a interview with a medical, I think it was a medical student, and they asked the student, you know, to describe what they thought about the evidence of learning styles. And what this person had said was that they were kind of shocked and almost to a degree insulted that many people are being taught and using your learning style methodology or theory. And when we compare it to the level at which we need to practice medicine in any of the medical realms, it's mind-boggling that someone would use something that is so poorly supported by evidence to teach people about things that are extremely heavily based on evidence. So research findings in the case of education are used to direct decisions about teaching methods, assessments, and interventions. A very well-known and I would say seminal systematic review was performed by a team of cognitive psychologists. And they were asked, they were commissioned, in fact, to assess the scientific evidence for application of learning style assessments. And so they were asked to determine, what they identified is they had to determine the type of evidence or types of evidence required for pedagogical choices based on students' learning style assessments, and also determine the existence of such evidence. And so this is the approach to study design that they identified as being the gold standard, okay? So all learners should be, let's say in a group, you have all learners, and then they undergo a learning styles assessment. And from there, they are identified as visual learners or verbal learners, as is the case in this. Now, the visual verbal learners, you could argue, is just one example. You could use other types of learners, but in this case, this is what they're using as visual and verbal learners as their two arms. And from the visual learners, you would expose them to visually tailored instruction and verbally tailored instruction. And the verbal learners would also be given visually tailored or verbally tailored instruction. All would receive the same testing, and ultimately then positive results would be indicated by visual learners who receive visual instruction outperform visual learners who receive verbal instruction, and then the reverse for the same for verbal and verbal versus verbal and visual. And so this is considered to be the gold standard according to these authors. And it's important to note that these authors, they were a team of authors, cognitive psychologists, and they all had different views about the use of learning styles inventories. None of them were declared as to be passionate about any of them, but they had different views. And so they tried to be as dispassionate in their workup and analysis of what they found. And so those that used the correct approach with positive results, they were able to find only one study. And the results they found felt were possibly positive in showing this. Oh, and by the way, actually, I'll just go back here. So when a person with a certain learning identity, if you will, so visual learners receiving visual instruction, that would be considered matched or meshing, which is the hypothesis as well as the verbal. So there's a match between the style that a person learns and the instruction that they receive. And so if there is a positive outcome, i.e. a better effect, then that is considered a positive matching hypothesis, or it's been proven. But so what they found was one study that showed the correct approach, but the results were possibly positive methodology. There were a lot of missing parts and limitations to the study. And those that actually used the correct approach and had good methodology actually showed negative results. So again, not supporting. And these are not the only studies, but at this point, based on this publication, this is what they were able to find. The studies, as I list here, so here's the meshing matching hypothesis. As I sort of mentioned, once preferred style is identified using a chosen framework, the learner will achieve more if taught and studies using their preferred style. These are more publications, which I won't go into detail with, but these are more examples of studies that have disputed the idea of the match or meshing hypothesis, or disproved. So overall, the limitations and what many people consider critical problems are a lack of clear explanatory framework for any of the learning styles, inventories, or constructs. There are issues surrounding measurement. How do you actually measure and you know, the outcomes of these things, and also how reliable and valid are these in I guess identifying these preference or these learning styles in individuals. The inability to demonstrate a link between learning styles and achievements, so that meshing or matching hypothesis has not yet been shown to be I'm losing my thoughts right now, but anyway, relevant. And then risks of misassigning learners to a particular style. So that's one of the big, I would say, risks that I've come across as I've been reading more and more about this, is the idea that, you know, okay, well, you've done this inventory with a group of students, and you've identified them as, oh, you're kind of a visual learner. Okay, so then you need to focus on learning from a visual standpoint. So whatever that means, graphs, diagrams, or whatever. And that may pigeonhole learners. And we know that, as we'll see in a few slides, that there are other ways of learning that are more supported by evidence. And so it's not necessarily that and I, to be honest, one of our learners and I recently had a discussion about this. And this person had told me, oh, I always thought I was a visual learner. I went on a rotation, and I told my preceptor, oh, I'm a visual learner, so I really need to be getting everything visually. And you know, they admitted that it was horrible because they didn't understand a lot of it, despite it being visual. And so I think it's very much dependent on the situation and particularly what you're actually being taught at the time. There's also a concern about costs associated with employing learning styles tools in organizations. So that could be educational institutions or companies with little to no supporting evidence for effect. And then there's also the practicality of differentiation. So if you did a learning style inventory with a class of 20 people, they're depending on which inventory you used, you might have more than 2 or 3 or 4 different kinds of learning styles that have been identified. And so how do you plan and meet everyone's learning style? It can be quite difficult to try and differentiate for every single person. Where is this? So some recommendations for change. So Antoniuk and colleagues wrote a very interesting paper that was recently published just a few years back, and they talk about the idea of learning styles. It's actually a pretty good review of everything. It's well written, and one of the areas that they talk about, though, is what can we do differently apart from using learning styles. So she talks about the idea of different, and these are actually all based on some degree of evidence as well, is this idea of community of education. And so creating a welcoming environment. I mean, I think, and I'll say this before I continue, is I think a lot of these are probably inherent in things that we already do and things that we consider, but creating a very welcoming community, trying to support or to encourage alliances between the teacher and the learner, and to build that sort of strength in comfort, I guess you could say, using multimodal approaches. So not just one type of approach. So I'm going to do this visually, I'm going to do this for that person, and so forth. Having students elaborate or learners elaborate more. So if you ask a question and they give an answer, well, can you elaborate more on that? Let's discuss this more. Personal relevance, I think, is helpful. I think, though, depending on the situation, might be a little bit more difficult to incorporate. And then test effects. So have people self-test. That's an important thing we'll talk about on a few slides from now, is this idea of self-testing, which I think a lot of us do inherently, and we do on our own. We may not recognize it as such, but I think we do a lot of this, and this can actually has been shown to help as well. Of note, this and the next slide seem to be geared more towards school-age children, though I think some of the principles and ideas can still be helpful. And I can anecdotally speak to a few of these things that I've already sort of incorporated in when interacting with the learners that we have in the center. Providing opportunities to learn obviously can help to motivate people, particularly if they're interests of the particular learner. Encourage participation. So not trying to give everyone, I guess, a turn is one way to put it, but more of, encourage that participation. So without really picking on people, but try and really have them get involved, and not just have a few main people that are more vocal participate. Show support and provide support for learning, and provide feedback as well. Again, these things I think are pretty common to all of us, and regardless of age. These are some other approaches that I would also consider, and I think, again, some of this is sort of inherent and what's the word I can't think of right now, but it would come to us naturally. Mode of instruction should match the nature of the subject taught. So visual instruction for things like geometry or geography, verbal instruction for things such as poetry, kinesthetic for, let's say, for instance, you're doing a physical examination course, that would be probably more appropriate to use than just reading this, or just showing diagrams, or just, right? No one's to say that you can't do those other things, in fact, but and I think they would be encouraged, really, but it's more of, think about what you're teaching or what is going to be taught, and then what do you feel would be, naturally the most applicable kind of approach, but again, not excluding the So dynamic testing is interesting. So there was a public or this group Sternberg and Grigorenko came up with this idea of dynamic testing, something that I think again is something that is done. It may not be labeled, but first is to determine where you kind of stand in an area. So that might be done by testing someone. So say, for instance, I'm going to pick on my colleague Vince because he's evaluating me. So maybe it's not the wisest choice, but so let's say for Vince, I want to determine how much oncology knowledge does he have. So I'm going to bring him into the office. Vince, here's a test for you, kind of a general, all-encompassing kind of thing. We'll just want to get an idea about how much you know about oncology. So Vince writes the test and he does however he does. But what we do from that is say, okay, well, Vince, you know what? Your supportive care knowledge is pretty good, which is great. But you are really not very strong in the areas of mechanism of action for the chemo agents or the treatment agents. So we need to focus on that. And so that's where the effort goes, not necessarily on his supportive care, because he knows that. Why would we focus on that? Let's focus on the areas that are, let's say, lacking. And then after a period of time, we will retest Vince and say, okay, Vince, how did you do? Okay, is there improvement? Is there not improvement? Okay, do we need to reevaluate this? Do we need to reapproach it in a different way? And then this cycle continues. And that is the idea behind mastery. Mastery, and I'll say it later on one of the slides, mastery is not something that occurs overnight. It takes time, and understanding that is really, really important. Oh, how true, Vince says. Okay, that's great. Yeah. I love that. Yeah, his knowledge of oncology. Final thoughts, and I say a la Brown et al. And so this is, I've sort of adapted some of the messages that were delivered in this one very excellent book, I must say, if you're interested in education, something that we were told about in a few of our lectures, I guess, last year in the Education Scholars Program. This book is called Making It Stick, The Science of Successful Learning. And I have no interest shares, nothing like that in any of it. I'm just saying it because it's a pretty good book. And I have to say it's a very interesting take. And it's really based on trying to push these ideas based on evidence. But their thoughts are mastery. So I call it mastery. They had a different sort of title for this, but basically it's up to you. Okay, it's up to you to push yourself to learn, to identify areas where you want to improve on. And remember, it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. It's not a 100-meter dash. To become a master or to master a certain area, it takes time, it takes reevaluation, it takes effort. But, and so that's their first sort of piece of advice. Multiplicity. And by the way, I just tried to make all these words M's. So when we get to masochism, don't take it literally. I'll explain what I mean. Anyway, multiplicity. So avoid the pigeonhole of preferential learning style. Approach learning and mastery using different approaches. And again, there are probably situations where, you might learn the same thing in a certain context using a certain type of learning, right? So it's, let's say, visual. Other times you might be learning something about the same subject, but maybe in a slightly different way, and auditory is more helpful for you, and so on and so forth. So don't just limit yourself, is really what they're trying to say. Don't limit yourself to one thing because you've been identified as a visual learner. I love pictures. I love visual things. I'm very much a visual person when it comes to art and stuff, but I'm also a very auditory. I play music as well, which is right. I wouldn't consider myself learning better in one way or the other because of those things either. So be open to other styles. So masochism is not really masochism. What it is the idea that I just couldn't think of another M word to sort of describe this, but utilize active learning tools. Okay, don't fear self-assessment, and just because something is hard to learn doesn't mean you're not understanding. If you can push yourself through and actually end up understanding it, that difficult learning can pay dividends. And then the makeup, this is one of the other, they call it structure. They talk about structure, creating a structure. So makeup is really identify principles, determine relationships and the structure of an idea or of a subject or of a topic, right? So knowledge is one thing, but know-how is another. So knowing that things occur versus knowing how they are two different things. And so their idea is that try and understand that makeup, identify first principles, see how they relate to each other, and build a relationship and structure for that. So in summary, learning styles are commonly used in education and elsewhere in many different levels, and particularly in the medical sciences. Learning styles are not strongly supported by evidence, and alternative approaches to teaching and learning should be employed. I would also add that, you know, I think there's potentially still merit for doing further research on some of the intent and some of the aspects of learning styles, but that's my own sort of personal thought on it. So hopefully I've achieved the learning objectives as I stated at the beginning. So appreciate the intention of, limitations and risks associated with the use of learning styles, discuss the evidence for and against the use of and need for learning styles, and outline alternative evidence-based approaches to teaching and learning. And I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any. Okay, well, thank you. So I hope everyone is in a food coma right now, digesting their lunches. Maybe my monotonous